And I guess I'll just start with, I'm going to recap kind of some upcoming events at the end here, but I'll start by inviting you guys, if you're new to Loco Think Tank and you ever want to check out what we call a free think, that's coming up on August 31st, and we're doing the first ever free lunch and think. And so we're going to buy lunch for the attendees and limit the registration to a maximum of 10, and have basically the free sample version of what our chapters do at Loco Think Tank. I'm Kurt Bear. If you don't know me, probably most everybody does, or at least heard of me. And it's my pleasure today to introduce Gabriel DeRita. And Gabe and I were introduced actually by my staff member, Alma, who took his session at the Founded in FOCO event this spring and said, this guy's really smart, he should do a webinar for us. And so I met with Gabriel and had a cup of coffee and talked about how smart he was for a while, and I was convinced she was right. And so we scheduled a webinar, and here we are. So Gabe, if you don't mind, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit further and introduce your business a little bit, as well as what we're going to talk about today.
Thanks, Kurt. I appreciate that generous intro. And yeah, I do this work that we're going to talk about today, the kind of authentic relating and hard conversation stuff, as my bread and butter. So I work full-time as a leadership development coach and facilitator, primarily helping organizations and teams get better at human interaction, creating connection, aligning with purpose, and really driving from values. So that's the center of my coaching work, and that's also the center of the work I do with teams. And that was the session that Alma and I met at the Founded in FOCO event. Was really around these relational techniques to build common ground in challenging interactions. And at its core, it's really just about the art of being a better human. This is just about kind of making your skill in relationships a little bit more effective or a little bit more engaging, right? So it's not just about professional context, it's about personal context as well. And I came to this work kind of I found it actually at a workshop in Bali, Indonesia. I had quit my tech job and I was like traveling the world, trying to find myself, doing that whole thing. And I was like, this is way too good for the hippies to have to themselves. This stuff is awesome. And so I took it back and started a business around some of this purpose alignment and authentic relating work, because I really felt like this is the type of thing that they should teach in schools. This is the type of thing that I wish I knew when I was, 17, 18, trying to figure out how to connect and communicate and build relationships. I was never really taught how to do this skillfully. And so that's what I want the invitation to be for everybody here, is to think about how some of this stuff might already be true for you in your life. I like this technique, these practices, because you don't need a degree in behavioral science to understand it. They're really simple and actionable practices that we can kind of put into play in our lives to make our relationships richer and easier and just be more effective in the connections we're trying to build, both personally and professionally. And usually when I run these workshops, it's like a 90-minute to 2-hour session. So it's going to be a little compressed today to kind of get through everything I want to cover in 45 minutes. But I really want everybody on the call to be using the chat to ask questions, to kind of share insights or reflections as we go. And we're going to open up the floor at the end for a discussion around that stuff. And again, I really want you guys to think about how is some of this stuff, like maybe just a vocabulary for experiences I've already had, or maybe how is this something that would have been really helpful had I had those words to describe it the last time it happened. And so those are the examples I really want to kind of pull out and to discuss together at the end of our time, because I think that's how we kind of take this home and put it into the context of our lives. And that's what I'd love for each of you, is like, if you just take one of these practices forward and use it in your next conversation, I think it was a success and a great use of time. And that's what I see a lot of feedback from on the teams that I support this with, because I run this as a training for organizations where folks are like, you know what, just like the next conversation I had, I tried that one thing, right? It's like that one weird trick doctors don't want you to know. Like, there are some tricks in here that are like that. Like, if you just try this out the next time, see what's different, see if you notice any impact or change. And so I'm going to kind of be moving quickly through some of the concepts here, just at the beginning, to talk about what are these foundational practices of authentic relating, how do they work both internally for us and in relationships, and using those practices of authentic relating as a foundation for engaging with difficult conversations. And I'm going to give you guys 5 steps on both the giving and receiving side of a difficult interaction to try to slow things down and build common ground. Whether somebody just kind of comes at you with something really difficult and you're sort of caught off guard, like, whoa, where did that come from? Or you're trying to kind of initiate that difficult conversation, right? They're like, hey, we need to talk text, that like pit of the stomach feeling when I see Alicia nodding, like maybe you sent one of those last week, but like we've all been there, right? And so picture yourself in that interaction in that moment. And these tools are ideally going to be useful in just helping you get more of what both of you need from that interaction the next time you have to have it. Because we can't avoid difficult conversations. And that's actually the number one foundational dysfunction of a team is like a lack of trust that's rooted in conflict avoidance, because people just don't feel safe having conversations like this. So I'm going to dive in just with a bit of these practices that I found really valuable and transformational in my life. And again, want to engage with you guys in the chat, encourage you to post questions and reflections as we go, and we'll have a chance to discuss and debrief those at the end. And so my slides are not the prettiest in the world because I'm not a graphic designer, but hopefully some of this stuff is just clear and useful. Maybe Kurt's team could help me out with that next time. So we're really looking for common ground here, right? How to get better at hard conversations and finding that common ground in challenging interactions. Kurt, can you guys see the slides?
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. And so the foundation of this, again, is rooted in these 5 practices of authentic relating. And I'm just going to kind of drill into these in a little bit more detail. The first is welcome everything. The second is to assume nothing. The third is to reveal your experience. The fourth is to own your experience. And the fifth is to honor self and other. And these are practices, right? Not ideas, not principles. These are things that are meant to be lived as verbs. So what do we actually mean by each of these in practice? The first, welcome everything, doesn't mean we have to like what's happening, actually. I get pushback on this sometimes to say like, oh, does this mean I'm just kind of being a pushover or maybe whitewashing things? Sometimes people call this spiritual bypassing, where you're just like making everything into roses and rainbows or not wanting to address the difficulty. That isn't what we mean at all. It means we're able to be with an experience without being sucked into it, right? So without like the mercury rising so much that we lose our ability to respond with the choices that we want. And instead we're just reacting from our conditioned tendencies or our triggers and these patterns of behavior. So that's really what welcoming is. It's being able to sit with that sizzle and not needing to kind of jump in, not trying to fix it right away or not avoiding it, where we're able to just kind of say like, I can hold this without being overwhelmed by it. So even something as simple as saying like, I felt angry with you, or I feel angry with you when you cut me off before I finished speaking, versus like saying, I'm angry, you never let me finish. Right. So that I'm angry, you're fully identified with the emotion, versus I'm feeling angry, you're still in that observer seat. And that's really what this practice feels like, is we're able to cultivate this practice of equanimity, which is a concept I learned from meditation practices, which is simply just kind of balanced awareness or abiding with something, even if it's a challenging sensation. And so a metaphor that I like is widening the window. I learned this from a trauma researcher named Elizabeth Stanley, who works with veterans of PTSD. And she noticed that our capacity to kind of stay between that fight or flight reaction is really that process of cultivating resilience. And we can widen that window of tolerance over time. So when we're practicing welcoming everything, that's what it feels like. We can withstand a little bit more tension before we kind of go into that react mode. The second practice, assume nothing, I actually think is just a total misnomer. It just looks cute together. Welcome everything, assume nothing. You can't actually do this because what we're all doing all the time is making meaning of our experience based on what happened the last time, based on our cultural beliefs, based on how we were raised, based on the things we value, right? Based on what we heard on the news or internalized in school, right? So we all have this subjectivity that we're bringing to every interaction that we have. And that's actually creating a lot of assumptions and a lot of stuff that isn't actually present moment data, but it's past experiences, sort of those rose colored or maybe, even black glasses. Like your perspective is influencing how you see the present. And so the skill here is actually to get good at noticing those assumptions, naming them, and being willing to drop them. So it's a real practice of slowing down and kind of getting curious with your experience and just checking out those stories And there's a couple little sentence stems here that are really helpful, right? Like, I'm telling myself, you don't value my opinion, or I assume everybody here's on the same page, right? I have a story that you don't like me. It seems to me we're getting along really well, right? So these are all like assumptions or experiences or stories we're telling ourselves about our experience, other people's experience, the energy in the room. All we have to do is just investigate it, right? And check out, how is this influencing my choice and my behavior in this moment? And I've coached managers who are like really hard on a new hire, and micromanaging them because the last person who did that job was really ineffective. And it took them realizing that that was an assumption to kind of change the way they offered opportunity to that new employee, to say, actually, we're going to give this person a chance. They're not Rick, they're not Jane. They're somebody totally different. I have to give them a blank slate and the benefit of the doubt. So these assumptions are really insidious and they creep in all the time. And it's a really powerful skill when we're able to tease that story out and meet the present as it is and kind of step out of that, like letting the emotion drive our interaction with someone. The third practice, reveal your experience, I think often gets a bad rap too. People think this means like the vulnerability Olympics, right? Or just kind of being like speaking the ticker tape of your unconsciousness into every conversation. And that's not what we mean at all. It's not just about being like overly revealed all the time, right? If we don't have boundaries with people, we don't build trust. So what we mean by reveal our experience is really being curious with ourselves, just like the noticing assumptions piece. It's kind of checking in and getting below the surface and being present and honest with what's going on in our internal world, and even being able to kind of tease out the parts, right? So part of me might be really annoyed with that off-color comment that you made, but another part of me might be curious about what you meant or how I might have misunderstood you in that moment. So can I lean into that curious part instead, right? Can I reveal that like there's annoyance here and there's some curiosity? Let me actually choose the part that's going to bring me closer to relationship and build connection instead of confrontation. It's also about being honest about our limits, right? Like maybe our kid was sick last night or we're coming down with the flu and we got up at 3 a.m. and like we're just a little bit lower bandwidth today. And just saying that to somebody can help them meet us in our needs in that moment. It's like, oh, cool. Yeah, my kid was sick last week too. I totally know where you're coming from, right? Hey, if I ask you to repeat yourself, it's because I really want to understand you, right? Like just these little things that help build that ability to connect and help folks understand where we're coming from. That's what that practice of revealing experience can look like. And sometimes just the experience of describing our own emotional landscape to ourselves helps us metabolize it or move through it in an effective way. Just an acknowledgement that something feels hard can help us kind of offer ourselves a little more self-compassion and understanding so that we don't have to project that onto others or ask other people to meet our emotional needs for us. Sometimes we can just do a little bit of that for ourselves by taking time to slow down and notice what's arising and give ourselves a little bit of self-understanding. But when we do reveal to others, we want to do it with 100% owned language, which takes us to our fourth practice, which is owning our experience. And when we share our experience with full ownership, it means it's unarguable and without projection. And this can be really sneaky too, just like the assumptions piece. And I'm going to pick on Kurt because, we've met and had a cup of coffee, but none of the things I'm going to say are true. But I might say something to Kurt like, I feel like you never listen to me, right? So I used an I statement, right? For friends familiar with nonviolent communication, right? Like the I statement, I did the thing, but like there's still a projection there because you never listen to me is a judgment about Kurt. That's not a sensation in my body. That's not an emotion that I'm having. And it's arguable. Kurt be like, yeah, I totally listened to you. I read your whole email, right? So like he can push back versus saying something like, Kurt, I feel unheard when you cut me off in the middle of a client presentation, right? So like me feeling unheard is unarguable. Kurt can't say like, no, you don't feel that way, right? He could gaslight me maybe, I guess, but like it's, you know what I mean? I'm speaking from my experience and the impact Kurt's behavior is having on me in a way that's meant to minimize the blame or the projection about Kurt and just give him a lens into my reality to help him understand what's happening for me, right? So that's how we really reveal our experience, unarguably, to create that bridge for connection and understanding. So we're not ignoring the impact of the behavior, but we're trying to show Kurt what's going on without him feeling judged or blamed, which he probably will anyway, right? But we're trying to minimize that defensive reaction in others. So when we say things like, I feel like you just blah, 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 Usually not owned, usually not the best way to create connection in relationship, usually going to lead to more conflict. So we really want to watch for that reaction when we're sharing our experience. And we really want to look for ways to respond to a situation instead of react to it. Coming back to that welcome everything, can we just be with it and try to hold it and be at choice with it? And a meditation teacher I had taught me this phrase I really like. She said, center yourself so you don't center yourself. Meaning, get grounded, get present, get centered so you don't have to take center stage. So your energy isn't sucking all the air out of the room, right? So that you're not needing to have all the things that are coming up for you, just like battering the other person. Are you centered and grounded and resourced? So you can make space for others. So you can make space for what needs to emerge in the relationship in that moment. Are you centering yourself so you don't center yourself? I think that's a great way to look at how we're owning our experience. And it is our responsibility to cultivate our response ability, right? So like we can't control what happens to us. We can't control what other people do. But what we can control is our ability to respond to what happens. So that impact that other people have on us, that's the part we need to take ownership of. And when we're in ownership, that's what it looks like. People can come at us with whatever. And we're able to kind of sit there and say, okay, I don't really like that, but I'm going to respond to it in a way that's like non-judgmental, that's effective, and that's in ownership. Because ultimately we give our power to what we blame. So whether you're blaming interest rates or Bitcoin or the dog that ate your homework or the narcissistic boss, right? Like if that thing that lives outside of you controls your inner emotional experience and your sense of agency, you've just handed them the keys and said, please drive for me. I'm not interested in showing up today, right? So like we give those our power over to those things that we blame. So looking for ways that we're blaming can really help us find ways to claim more ownership, because we can take that back and say, actually, no, you know what? I'm going to take ownership for this piece. I don't like how this feels, but I'm responsible for the choices that I make in as a reaction to those things, right? So there's lots of ways that ownership shows up. And I think this practice has a lot of value for each of us, because I struggle with this, right? Totally candidly, like I always want to find something to blame. I'm always trying to be like, yeah, but I can't do that. Like, just really slow down and double check that, right? Where could you take even 10% more ownership in that relationship and see what will be different if you did? And the fifth one, I like to say this is like the rug in the Big Lebowski. It really ties the room together, right? So this is where all this stuff kind of meets in practice. Honor self and other. So honoring self means we're aware of those needs and boundaries, right? We've revealed our experience. We're working on kind of that ownership piece. And honoring other means we're willing to bring curiosity. We're willing to step out of those assumptions and judgments and really kind of try to meet them with an open-hearted compassion and curiosity for where they're coming from. And it's important in this to know the difference between your stuff and their stuff, right? So honoring self and other doesn't mean we're being a martyr or we're always taking on other people's baggage, or we're trying to just fix it all the time. It really means we're willing to sit with something and say, you know what, I can own this piece, but that over there, that's actually you. In my perspective, in this moment, I don't feel like I need to take ownership of everything you're experiencing. And I see this a lot with leaders and a lot with coaches too. I coach a lot of coaches, and people who are really empathetic tend to absorb a lot of other people's experience too. And so if you're a good manager, it probably means you're a people person. And if you're a people person, it probably means you're just going, oh, let me take care of it. I'll fix it for you. Let me do that. But that actually creates a culture of dependency. And it doesn't really honor that person's ability to be creative and resourceful on their own. And so sometimes honoring others means like letting them fail and learn, stepping back from being right in the middle of the fray to watch something unfold. So honoring others can look a little bit different than we might think it means in terms of like acts of service or generosity. And the model we have for generosity in our culture is like the Shel Silverstein giving tree, right? It's like, take everything I have until there's nothing left. But that doesn't honor ourselves, because we can't pour from an empty cup. And that's actually what doing this looks like, is honoring ourselves first, not as an act of selfishness, but an act of service to others. Because when we're well-resourced, we can be generous. And when we're generous, we're honoring others and we're supporting them more effectively. So it's like that classic oxygen mask metaphor, right? Everybody who's flown on a plane has heard it. Put on your oxygen mask before helping others. You really have to do that in every aspect of your life to make sure your needs are met, so that it's easier to center yourself and you're not grabbing everything in the room when you feel like you finally have the chance. right? So you can't honor others without honoring yourself. And ultimately, people take their cues for how to treat us based on how they see us treating ourselves, right? If we're the type of person who, is really clear with their boundaries around time, or asks for what they need, or asks for help, other people are going to feel more trusting of us, versus like if we're just the pushover, or we're always working till 3 a.m. or whatever it is, they're going to devalue our time and just say, oh, Gabe will take care of it anyway. Right. So how are we helping others honor us by honoring ourselves more effectively is a great question to ask. And the simplest way I've found to get to the root of this honor self and other piece is just to simply ask what's needed here. So what do I need? What do you need? Where does that Venn diagram kind of overlap, right? Is there any common ground we could find in like the needs in this moment? Or are there any kind of important non-negotiables that sit outside that overlap that we really need to work to address? And who's heard of the golden rule? Have you heard of the golden rule? Has anybody here heard of the platinum rule? Hands up for the platinum rule. Kurt's got it. All right. So the platinum rule is great. And I wish I knew this when I was younger. The platinum rule isn't treat others as you want to be treated, right? That's the golden rule. The platinum rule is treat others as they want to be treated. Treat others as they want to be treated. Because guess what? We're all different. And what we do by default is we try to give other people what we would want if we were hurt in a similar way. We try to give other people the thing that we often feel afraid to ask for, right? That's the I think that's the sympathy versus empathy. Sympathy is like, I can picture what it would feel like for me to feel that way. Empathy is like, I understand you deep enough to know what you need to be met. And that requires us to slow down and get curious about that person's experience first to really find out how to meet them effectively. And so if Kurt is trying to apologize for hurting my feelings and cutting me off by buying me 5 gallons of the best vanilla ice cream in Colorado, but I'm allergic to vanilla, how effective is that apology, right? Kurt did all this extra work. He went and found this amazing ice cream. He drove it to my house before it melted. He's trying to say sorry. And he gets there and I'm like, I can't even eat this, man. I guess thank you. But like how versus being like, oh, Gabe loves chocolate. I'm going to go find him the best chocolate ice cream in Colorado. Then he shows up with that same gallon and I'm like, whoa, oh, thank you. I love this. I really felt met by Kurt by that apology, but it takes time to slow down and figure those things out, to how to honor others more effectively. And so that's something we can watch for in relationships. Like, are we jumping into fix it mode? Are we trying to just do the thing for somebody else that we want them to do for us by means of apology, right? Or are we really slowing down and getting curious to understand what does that person need to feel met and understood and honored by me? Can we live from that platinum rule instead of the golden rule? Because unfortunately, the golden rule is what we've been told works best. But in my lived experience, that's not necessarily the case. So these are our 5 practices at a high level. So welcome everything, assume nothing, reveal your experience, own your experience, and honor self and other. And before we move forward, I'd love for folks to just paste in the chat, which one of these do you think is the most challenging for you? Right? I kind of revealed a little bit of mine, right? Like I know I struggle with the ownership and assumptions. Those are my 2 Achilles heels, but would love for folks to see like what's here, right? What do folks think are their particular challenges that they might want to work on after this call? You don't even have to come off mute. You can just paste it in the chat. Yeah, Hilda says assumptions too. Assume nothing from Alicia. Who else has a favorite? Owning experience. It can be a tough one too. Folks are really good at welcoming everything. I usually see that come up at least once. Be honest.
In this community, yeah.
Yeah, that's a favorite. I see lots of assume nothing, a couple for own your experience, right? So then the invitation would be take something forward and think about, how would I maybe get 10% better at that, in the next week, in the next 2 weeks? What would I do? What behaviors would need to change for me to become a little bit more effective at this process, at this thing that's hard for me to do? Yeah, Jen says honor self. That's a tough one too, right? We always want to be supportive in giving to others. Can we be just as supportive in giving to ourselves? Could we, offer ourselves the same level of support and care and advice that we'd offer a dear friend? And most of us, I'm speaking for myself, but a lot of the folks I coach too, it's like the way you talk to yourself in your head, you would never talk to another person that way. So could you kind of check your self-talk and say, wow, how does this differ from the people I care about? Do I care about myself as much as I care about those people? And why am I not acting the same way? So that can be a really powerful practice too. So then how do we take all of this and apply it to conflict, right? What's the connection here? And I guess before we move forward, Kurt, I just want to give you a chance to step in here since you have your hand raised.
Yeah, you asked me to remind you when it was 9:30.
Yep.
So we're there. And then I had a quick question from Henry of, will you be willing to share this slide deck?
Not the whole deck, but I can send out a PDF that has these practices in it.
Okay, that'd be great.
I can do that. We'll get that to you in the follow-up.
Perfect. Thank you.
We're right on time.
Very good.
I want to talk about how we do this in conflict next. So we got about 15 minutes left to get through this. And so conflict is nobody's favorite topic, right? Unless you may be like some kind of masochist or MMA fighter or like an HR expert. Like nobody really loves these challenging conversations, right? But there's really good reasons to move towards this with a little bit more enthusiasm, especially in an organization, especially in a relationship. The first is teamwork, right? Trust is built by going through a challenging thing together. So like when you think about somebody you did something really hard with, I mean, the military leverages this, right? The crucible of boot camp really makes that unit strong. Or like that vacation you went on where like your backpack got washed down the river, or that horrible weekend with the in-laws, like you felt closer to the person you endured that with on the other side of that experience. So it builds trust. Clarity is also built. So you don't always know a boundary till you crossed it, right? Sometimes the only way to find out that platinum rule is to really like step on somebody's toes a little bit. And like, hopefully the relationship is resilient enough to handle that. But you sometimes will really get a lot of clarity about what somebody needs when you fail to meet those needs, and you have to kind of get into it and hash it out. Connection is also built, right? There's a depth of understanding on the other side of challenge that can really come through when you've gone through a crucible with someone. And there are a lot of relationships and friendships. Sometimes I don't really trust them until there's been some kind of like having it out. You know what I mean? Because I don't really know what that person's like when they're under duress. If the relationship's just all good times, you're always kind of wondering what would happen if the other shoe dropped? You know, how would this person really show up in a difficult interaction? And so you have that trust and depth of connection when you've been through that process together. And the final piece I think is really relevant to today's work cultures, because everybody's talking about diversity, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, super hot topic, right? But a lot of teams I see means like they take diversity to mean we're going to hire people with a bunch of cultural, socioeconomic, and racial backgrounds, and then train them to talk and act and think the same way. And is that really diversity? Like, no, you're actually stripping the value out of your team's thought pool by doing that, because embracing diversity means embracing dissonance and making room for those different opinions, those different ways of being in the world, those different thought patterns to show up and have space at the table. And that might mean we disagree about an approach, but what could we learn from each other in that disagreement? So do we have the capacity to hold that disagreement effectively in our relationship, in our teams, in our organizations, so that all of those resources of thought and those plurality of perspectives can kind of inform what we do together? So that's what I think is a real powerful piece of conflict here, is like using it for creativity and recognizing that dissonance and difference and disagreement is actually really fertile soil for powerful ideas to emerge, versus if we're just trying to create a monoculture and homogenizing everybody's thoughts and ideas. That's not diversity. Even if they look different than us and they're thinking and acting the same, that's not what it means. So if we can get better at conflict, we can support the unlocking of those resources for our teams and for our relationships as well. So we're going to start with the receiving side, right? So when somebody comes at us real hot to trot, got some anger, got some charge, got some things they want to say to us, like how we react really matters. And we're going to use the metaphor of Aikido, which is a martial art that is the goal of that martial art is actually to disarm the opponent without causing harm to either party. So how can you use the attacker's energy to kind of like disarm them and protect yourself in the process? So that's kind of the operating metaphor we're using for this entire set of practices here. The first step is to do nothing. The second step is to completely listen. The third step is to reflect what you heard. The fourth is to take ownership. And the fifth is to share impact. So let's look at these in a little more detail. The first one, literally, like do nothing. welcome everything, right? Just receive for a minute, take a full breath. Come back to that center, maintain your dignity, right? Centering yourself so you don't need to center yourself. And in a heated exchange I had with a friend a few years back, we were in a very tense situation and she yelled at me, "Don't just do something, stand there." Which is a bit of a dyslexic flip of the typical "don't just stand there, do something." But I thought there was real wisdom in that, which is like we actually do just want to stand there. We don't just want to jump into do it mode, fix it mode, because that's where we're going to get to that golden rule trap, right? We're just going to try to make it better, or maybe we're going to dishonor ourselves. We're just going to move too quickly. We just want to sit there for a moment and let it land. The second is to completely listen. So how do we know we're completely listening? It means we're, again, taking a full breath. We're not just firing back with our clever rebuttal. We're asking a question instead of responding with a statement. So how many people have heard that phrase, most people aren't listening, they're just waiting to talk? And how many people have experienced that in a conversation, right? When somebody's just like, you can tell they've just been waiting with their like clever zinger the whole time. They weren't even listening to you at all. They were just waiting to say their bit. Don't do that. So you can ask a really simple question like the two modeled here to make that person feel fully heard and understood. Hey, is there anything else? Are you complete? Is there more you want to say? And they're going to be like, what? Yeah, there is. Or another thing. Or like, no, actually, that's totally it. But like, they're going to immediately feel that like adversarial like thing drop down because you're receiving them. You're not punching back. You're just like, yeah, wow, thanks for telling me. Is there more? What else do you want to say? Right? You're making space for them. And right out of the gate, that might lower the mercury just a bit. Step 3, reflecting back what you heard. And this means really kind of mirroring as best you can, right? What you heard them say. So instead of just like putting your spin on it, can you use their language as much as you can, right? And you can get it wrong. What I heard was blank. Did I get that right? Right? Checking for accuracy can actually be a really important step before moving forward too quickly. So that way you don't get anything lost in translation, right? So just really checking for accuracy. Did I get that right? Hey, I heard you say last Friday in the client meeting, I talked over you and you felt unheard. Is there anything else? Did I get that right? Right? So just trying to, as much as you can, to confirm and clarify your understanding before you move on to the next point. Take ownership. Step 4. You don't have to own everything, right? You don't have to apologize for everything. This doesn't mean you're taking on stuff that isn't yours. So you really want to balance boundaries with curiosity, but you do want to be willing to see or learn something you didn't see before. Because ultimately, this person is doing you a favor by sharing feedback with you. It's emotional labor for them. It's difficult to have a difficult conversation. So can you honor that by saying, oh yeah, I didn't see that point of view. You know, I guess I could see how you would be frustrated by that, right? I can try harder in the future to not step on your toes in that way, right? Or I'm glad I know that's a boundary for you, right? So I'm not apologizing. I don't feel like I have to, but I'm at least acknowledging that they did something hard and I could learn from that. And again, bringing back that ownership thing, you're 100% responsible for your response to their challenge. So can you hold compassion and curiosity instead of animosity here? That's the goal, because it may not be your fault, but it is your responsibility. And I like to say that a good, healthy relationship is 200% responsible, meaning both parties are willing to be 100% responsible for the outcomes. Because if they're not, somebody's always competing to be the greater victim, right? If it's imbalance, somebody's always trying to be the aggrieved one who's owed something. And if you notice that dynamic arising, call it out and try to challenge both of you to take more ownership of the situation. And the 5th is share impact. And this might not happen, and that's okay, right? You really want to get consent for this. Hey, are you open to hearing from me? Do you want to know what it was like for me in that meeting on Friday? You know, are you interested in my perspective here? And so if they say, yeah, great. You know what I mean? Sharing like, hey, I learned you want to feel heard, or hearing that I noticed I do talk a little bit, you know, quick in those sessions and I can try to slow down more, right? I noticed that I have a tighter relationship with that client and I really felt like my perspective was more valuable. And I wonder if this is really about you wanting more opportunity here instead, right? So just, again, I'm shooting from the hip here. I'm making this stuff up, but I'm talking about ways to share impact without blame or judgment, and just giving that person a chance to create a two-way conversation with you around the challenging interaction. So this, they might not be ready for this step. They might be too angry to hear from you. They might just want to be heard. It's important that you check in, but it's also important that you try to make space for what you have to say in the conversation. So that's the receiving side. Do nothing. Just be with it for a moment. Completely listen by asking a question in response to their statement. Reflect back what you heard and check for accuracy. Take ownership of anything you need to learn. That's also where the apology goes, by the way. If an apology is warranted, that's where you want to do it. Hey, sorry about that. And share impact if there's space for it in the last step. And now the giving side. Again, alchemy, which is transforming a crappy situation into something golden. And I actually have this thing on my desk that reminds me of this. It's a little piece of fossilized sloth poop, I think, or like ancient tortoise poop that I bought in the rock shop in downtown Fort Collins. And this is to remind me that I actually like this turned over millions of years from excrement to something I paid good American currency for. So there is possible for transformation in every moment to create value from a challenging interaction. So that's the process of alchemy here that we're going for. Starting with the why before the what, setting the context for the conversation, getting consent, sharing the content, which is like the issue or the thing you want to address, and checking for impact at the end. And so why before what? Again, I hate to say that like one weird trick, or if you only learn one thing from here, this might be one of the most effective things I've found in this process, is just centering the shared goals instead of the reason you're upset. Right? So the issue, the what you feel and the why you feel it, can you put that in the background and instead say, hey, I really want to be a more effective member of this team with you, or I really want to improve our friendship or our marriage, or I'd love to find a way to like get more effective at collaborating with you. And there's something in the way of that. Can we talk about it? And that person's going to say, yeah, I care about that thing too. What's wrong? Right? So you're again, you're creating an invitation to connection instead of confrontation when you're raising the issue. So do you understand what matters to that person enough to get their attention with a common ground goal? That's the most effective way to start a difficult conversation. So centering the relationship or something you both care about instead of the issue or why you're upset. It can be really simple and an invitation instead of confrontation. Setting the context. This is just in a fancy way of saying the agenda, right? Because a lot of times that, hey, we need to talk text, it feels like people are like, I don't want to open Pandora's box, but I don't know where this is going to go, right? They're nervous because they don't know what's in store. So can you just set a really specific scope of what you want and why you want it? So, hey, I want to talk to you about how we communicate with our clients, right? I want to set kind of some clear standards of communication so we can address some drop balls and places we were kind of stepping on each other's toes in the last few weeks. Does that sound good? It's like, I'm not talking about budget. I'm not talking about logistics. I'm just talking about communication, right? So this is the end goal of the interaction. Again, not why you're upset, just a really specific reason to get into a hard conversation. So that way they know what lane we're staying in. Getting consent, right? Are you okay with this? Are you available for this conversation? Can we make time where we're both going to be open to have this? Because if we're just steamrolling and coming in hot and like just making sure we say our piece when they're not ready, we're going to shut them down because we're going to cross that boundary and they're not going to be available. Instead of like learning that boundary and how they want to be met is going to be make us more effective in that honoring self and other. So, and checking in throughout, right? Hey, are you open to hearing more about this? Right? Not just, hey, at the beginning you said yes, and now I'm just going to keep rolling with it. Just be like, how does this landing for you? You know what I mean? Like, do you want to hear more or do we need to stop? So making sure that that person knows you're with them and not just trying to like win or kind of beat them up in the conversation. You're really like checking in, like, hey, how's this going? Right? Content. Everybody's favorite part. This is where you get to say your piece, right? This is the issue, the what you feel and why you feel it. But when we share it, we want to do it with 100% owned experience, unarguable and without judgment. And this formula I like is really simple, but it works well. Incident and impact, right? On Friday, when you spoke over me in the client meeting, I felt unheard, right? Instead of like, you always try to undermine me in front of our most important prospects. Or like, I feel like you just never trust me with the hard stuff in this organization, right? There's these big, broad, you always, you never kind of statements. And like, it can feel more like a character indictment than specific feedback if we do that, right? So people, that'll get them really defensive really fast versus like focusing on that specific behavior, that specific incident and the impact that it had. So that's the best way we can share that content and make it useful in a feedback context, just be really precise with how we share it. And then the fifth one, it's important when we're giving challenging feedback to somebody that we check in with them. Again, we're not trying to win here. We're trying to get to a common goal. So we can't make it a one-sided conversation. We have to find out, what's that like to hear? How's this landing for you? What's coming up? Right? Just chances to get their perspective so that they feel understood and heard. And it's not just like this one-way street where we're just coming down on them with something. We're really making room for their perspective as well. So that's the fifth and final step, right? So why before the what? Can you frame the conversation in terms of a common goal? Can you set a specific and narrow context so they know what they're getting into? Can you make sure that they're okay with it, both at the beginning and throughout the process? Can you share your content, your issue in a specific incident and behavior kind of like impact frame? And can you just check in with them as you go, right? Checking for impact, making sure that like they're heard and understood as we go through the process. And what do we do like when it goes off the rails, when it's hard, right? Like when this isn't working the way we want to, Gabe's magic formula is failing, you know what I mean? I didn't follow the steps. There's actually 4 magic words that can really help with that. And it's, can we slow down? Yeah. Can we just like, hold on, time out. Like we're getting out of scope here. Can we just like slow this down, come back to that center so we don't have to center ourselves? Can we just find this common ground or the why again? Can we just like slow down? Right. I'm noticing it's really hard to stay present. I'm getting really angry or like I'm misunderstanding you. Can we just slow things down? We always have permission to do this. Nobody tells you you have permission to do this, but you have permission to do this. Just slow it down. We can also, again, center ourselves so that we don't have to center ourselves in the interaction. We can come back to those shared goals and the why, like the reason we're having this conversation. We can also bring it back to the original context, right? We agreed to talk about communication and you're talking about budget right now. We need to actually have another conversation for that. Can we just bring it back to this one objective that we have, right? So really making sure that the reason we're having this conversation is what we're honoring in this moment. And like we can also tap out, right? Like we don't have to finish the hard conversation in one go. Maybe the issue is too big or too complex, or it's tied to all these other things. Maybe we're like, hey, you know what? This is a little bit bigger than I think I have time for or emotional bandwidth for right now. Can we just pause this? I learned a lot in this conversation and I need to come back to it another time. Or I need to think about what you said and really digest this so I don't respond in a way that I don't mean. So we have permission to do that too. Just kind of pause and come back to it if need be. So those are the kind of 5 steps to bring it back into alignment when we're off track. And these are the overview of the 5 steps on the giving side and the receiving side. When we need to take a screenshot or whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and just take one final look at these as we wrap up here. And I'm going to open it up to Q&A. And just thank you guys for letting me share this stuff, because I think this has been really helpful for me in my life. It's been really exciting for me to bring this to organizations and teams. If you guys are curious about doing more of this work with me, I don't run them usually like this as like a rapid fire slideshow. They're more experiential workshops where we actually get to break this stuff out into breakout groups and test it in dialogue. And we have much more fun with it when we actually get to try it out on conversation. So if you're interested in that, you can scan that QR code or just send me an email. And we can talk a little bit more about how you'd like to expand your connection to this work. And I'll stop this slideshow there and we can open up the floor to Q&A. I'll hand it back to you.
Very good. Before I allow that, I'd like to give just a quick, nice, concise, useful information. So thank you.
Thanks, Kurt. Appreciate it. I was worried about the timing. I was like, this is a big topic.
No, we're great. And I wanted to share a story, if you don't mind, if I go first. From just last week, we had an event. I don't remember, was it the summit or was it just a previous event, Alicia? But anyway, Alicia made time to talk with me and said, you know, the team environment at the local headquarters is really appropriate and honoring, and I always feel that we're valued and whatever, and you're such a good talker with a crowd and people around and stuff like that. But earlier, you called me and Alma the girls, and I have to say that feels a little bit disrespectful and maybe not honoring of my place as also in my 40s, and almost 20, and that doesn't mean she wants to be called one of the girls either necessarily. And I didn't, and so she did 2 things really right, which was, kind of affirm that teamness and the why before the what.
Mhm.
And as I recall the conversation, I didn't make excuse. I did, however, kind of say, you might hear me say the same thing at the Rotary Club with a couple of blue hairs. And so it's more of a figure of speech than a defining term for me and a cultural element. And yes, I think I can probably prevent myself from calling you guys the girls in a public environment. That seems very reasonable.
Yeah, I love that example, Kurt, of
And
like
there
how,
was the check-in moment too for context, and when it's more casual and you just kind of offhandedly say, can I join you girls or something, then it's less of an issue than when you're referring to your team that, and we took some time to talk about that, which was good because, that's the check-in part, and I gave Kurt the benefit of the doubt because I knew he didn't mean to disrespect us. But I wanted to share a perspective of how it came off to me that he might not have known.
Yeah, and she even helped define that. Like, if you come back to the office after lunch and me and all are sitting there, you say, "How are you girls doing this afternoon?" That's not in the same thing.
yeah, yeah, I love that example, and thank you both for being willing to reveal your experience here, right, and share like a candid example of how this works in practice. And you guys all have the skill and resources in your team to have seen each other more effectively in that
And I
interaction.
appreciate that Kurt's created that kind of environment where we can talk openly that way.
Yeah, that is a beautiful example of how that.
What else? We got a few more minutes here.
Love to hear questions from folks or other examples, other room for reflection. Hilda, I think you had a question in the chat. Do you want to bring that forward? You were asking about protective reactions.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm in my phone and it's kind of hard to open the camera. That's why I don't have it on. But
Okay.
I thank you for this presentation, and it just brought up so many questions. But I think the one that I would like to discuss with you right now is how you make the space for those authentic communication or authentic conversations, because I won't be telling you, especially if we're talking about boss and employee relationship, I'm not going to be telling you what I need if I don't feel safe. Or when you mention about diversity, well, I'm not going to show up as I am because there is no room for me to feel that how I am showing up is not going to be repercussions from doing that. So how to make those spaces in a way that people can have those conversations and authentically.
Yeah, thanks for that, Hilda. And a lot of what you're saying is really true. It's about psychological safety. And that's kind of a prerequisite for how deep we think we can go and how real we think we can be. And I've said before to folks that sometimes authentically relating means authentically not relating or honoring yourself and kind of setting some boundaries about what your expectations are or what's possible in a context, because you can't do this work alone. And so there are actually kind of like cultural parameters and limits on how effective you can be with some of this stuff. If the environment you're operating in is really adversarial or kind of tense and like doesn't have the room for, like you said, different voices to be heard, there's only so much you can do as an individual in that context. And so I want to kind of have a reality check here, right? That this isn't a magic bullet. But I do think that creating a little bit, even if it's just like 10% more space, right? To even if it's an anonymous feedback, even if it's a way to just have one or two peers or collaborators whom you feel you can really build that trust and vulnerability with, can make a difference with how we feel safe to be ourselves, and make space for those conversations. And maybe even trying some of those shared goals, right? If that person who you feel like doesn't have room to hear you, really is paying lip service to the idea, like, we're about our people here, or we really care about our, like, can you challenge them on their values a little bit and say, hey, I noticed this is a value in the organization here, or I hear people talking about this, and I've noticed some ways that I think we could do better to meet that value in practice. Are you open to some feedback around that? So like, because oftentimes we won't always agree with people, but we could like focus on those common values or shared experiences as a way to build trust and connection. Right. So even if we're not going to have everything in common, we could try to hone in on those areas of common ground or shared experience that can make us relate to one another more effectively, right? It's like, yeah, I'd also like to have this workplace feel more like a family, or I'd also like to, come into work every day not feeling like I'm going into a battle. You know what I mean? Like, I also want our communication to feel more fluid and easy. I want people to show up here as they are, right? And if none of those things are true, could you give yourself a chance to let yourself off the hook and say, this might not actually be something that's like a problem you could fix? And could you get better at honoring yourself and setting appropriate boundaries with how you could just be effective in your role, do what you need to do, but maybe not necessarily have the expectation that some of these deeper psychological needs are going to be met? Is that helpful?
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, it is helpful. I like the focus on the values part. Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
That's such an excellent point, Gabe, of that first step of checking in and kind of testing the environment and knowing for yourself what your boundaries need to be, because I've certainly rocked the boat before in previous jobs, and I knew I was risking a lot, and that was true, and I had to be ready to give up, the things I was risking. But it could have served me better maybe to care for myself if I checked it out more first before I went into the situation with confrontation, So that's a good self-care step,
Yeah. Because, you want to be effective, right?
Right.
When you're angry, sometimes you can be more effective by slowing down first.
And the common ground, working for the win-win. Kurt often says we're looking for the win-win-win. That's a great place to start in these tough conversations.
Yeah, it starts with shared experience and common values to kind of build that intersection for the win-win in many cases.
Right.
I have a couple of comments. One is that recently I've embarked on my latest, looking for my next adventure as my last position is ending. And through that process, have been studying growth mindset, which I think I see a lot of this in there. A lot of crossover between that philosophy to bring into all communication and all relationships. And then the other thing is, like, a lot of this stuff is, great information, and I've studied some of it in the past, but actualizing it is another thing. Like, even knowing it intellectually is one thing, but actually leveraging it. Do you have any thoughts about for us on how to really bring this into our everyday?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Henry. I think it was beautifully framed. And I see this all the time, right? I called it the willing versus wanting gap, right? Like, I want to do this, but I'm not willing to do this. Or the knowledge and wisdom gap, where, like, knowledge is knowing something, wisdom is embodying it. And that's why it's called the practices of authentic relating, right? Not the principles, not the theories. These are, again, they're meant to be verbs. And so my invitation to integrate this stuff would be pick one thing that you think would be really powerful for you to change in your relationships to your life, and just make it a discipline. Just like you would go to the gym, or you would meditate, or you would change your diet. It's about, like, slow, tangible behavior change. And James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits, has this phrase I really like, that he says, consistency beats intensity. Consistency beats intensity. So could we just, like, consistently do a little bit of this, instead of feeling like I have to go in and, like, welcome everything, or, like, I'm going to reveal all the stuff to you that's been hanging out in the background and fermenting and getting nasty for months. I'm just going to dump it all at once, right? Could I just do a little bit of this thing that's going to help improve the quality of this relationship consistently over time, to sort of help that person meet me where I want to be met? Because we're naturally, as humans, we co-regulate to each other. Right. So if, like, this person's all activated and hot all the time, and we are just a little bit cooler than them, like, over time, their system's going to try to calibrate to that equilibrium with us, because it's wasted energy to be hot and activated all the time. And their system wants to be met in that cooler, more balanced place. So that consistency over intensity, and really treating these like a practice, like anything else. Like, if you wanted to learn how to play pickleball, which I'm, like, still terrible at, like, can you just make it a practice? And turn it into a discipline? I think
if I'm gonna grab 1 minute at the end, Gabriel, I have to thank you and appreciate the great conversations here. I do want to mention, I put a couple of links in the chat. One is our next free think, as I mentioned, the free luncheon think. That's August 31st. I also selfishly put a Wild West Relay fundraising page link in there. Myself and 11 other runners are going to run from Fort Collins to Steamboat Springs starting Friday morning. And we're fundraising for Windsor Gives, which is a nonprofit that brings free timed running events and endurance education to kids at schools and charter schools in different places. And so if you care to drop $18 or $10 or something in that bucket for Windsor Gives, would be great. And then also coming up, if you're not subscribed to our events newsletter, where that just came out yesterday, so I'm referencing that, but Loco Think Tank is boasting 2 women of distinction this year. Our facilitator of the Loveland Next Level Catalyst, Allison Seebeck, as well as one of our longtime members, Jane Brewer, and that event is next week. If you're looking to see those power ladies celebrated, that's the Women of Distinction event on August 9th. And I think that's the bulk of it. Make sure, if you haven't noticed it yet, there's coming up in the fall is the what's the name of the big event in the fall for the ladies, Alicia?
Oh, the Unstoppable Women's Conference.
Yeah, the Unstoppable
Put out by the SBDC.
So
Great
Google
event.
that or go to the SBDC page of any of that's the Greeley, Loveland, and Fort Collins SBDCs are co-creating that event coming up in September. So don't miss it, especially since we got so many ladies on here. Hi, Henry, and you. So I think that's all. I just want to say thanks again to Gabriel. This recording will be available to reference, and it sounds like Gabe's going to have a little cheat sheet. Oh, and I was going to mention, Alicia, I was thinking those 2 lists of giving and receivings, that should just be a little picture on our office wall somewhere, and you can make it pretty. We'll steal that.
Yeah,
So
it's great when it becomes a common vocabulary on a team or in a relationship to do that. And I want to thank everybody for giving me their time and attention today. And there's a lot of competing priorities, and this work really excites me, and it's an honor for me to share it. It makes me feel like I'm on purpose and doing what I love. So thank you everybody for being here and giving me your time and attention. And I just put a link in the chat to connect with me too. Free 45-minute call if anybody wants to have a deeper conversation around this work. I'd love to find a time to chat further. So
cool. And we'll send that slide out as well as the recording access link here once Palma gets that put together and whatnot. So Godspeed.
This was so valuable, Gabe. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
very good. Thank you.